So our conversation today is about the role of policymakers in workforce development, and I'm thrilled to be joined by three individuals. And if I start on my far right or your left, Hank Bounds is the Commissioner of the State Institutions of Higher Education here in Mississippi. Jack Mills is the Director of the National Network of Sector Partners. And Mark Henry is the Executive Director of the Mississippi Department of Employment Security and President of the National Association of State Workforce Agencies. And so thank them all for joining us today. We really want to talk about a couple of things. One is to think about the different approaches to addressing workforce challenges within the policy framework, and we've heard a lot of conversation already this morning. And then to talk a little bit about what types of information or partnerships are most helpful to policymakers to engage successfully in local workforce development efforts. Panel today, as each of you has listened to the previous discussions, have you really heard any key topics or issues that might best be addressed in the policy arena? And if so, what suggestions might you have to help advance some of those issues? Mark, let's start with you.
Well, thank you, Karen. I think that we've had several people today talk about the need for flexibility, the need for innovation. That is a particular problem for the state workforce agency. We receive all the money to run the agency. We receive the WIA money, the Workforce Investment Act money, much but not all of the workforce training money from the federal government. The federal government is very inflexible in how they allow us to spend the money. I wouldn't say we have too much money to run our unemployment benefits program, but at times it would be very helpful if we could use some of that money for other areas, but the feds will not allow us to do that. We're only allowed to innovate in many ways if the Department of Labor will allow us to do that. Sometimes the Department of Labor is very interested in allowing us to innovate. Sometimes they're not at all interested in allowing us to innovate. You mentioned, Karen, that I'm the president of the National Association of State Workforce Agencies. That is the goal that I have in my year as president, is to see if I can get more flexibility from the federal government in how we spend the funds, in how we administer the programs, in how we develop the programs. What if, just think about this a minute, what if the federal government said to the workforce agencies, instead of you've got 4, 5, 10, 15, depending on how many grants you get, streams of funds, what if they had said, you have one stream of funds, and here are the goals you're supposed to reach, and we're going to hold you accountable for reaching those goals. And here's some ideas about how you might do that. But we're going to rely on you to develop the programs, to innovate, to how you get to that point, how you reach those goals. I think that we would see much more innovation. I think we'd see much more cutting-edge activities in the 50 states that you've heard the phrase, the states are the laboratories of democracy. The states would be much more able to innovate if they had more flexibility from Washington.
Jack.
You know, if I heard the same thing that the rest of you heard, I'd sum it up this way. We have complex problems, both in terms of employers' needs and also in terms of the individuals who constitute the workforce. Those problems are strengthened or made more significant by the fact that the world's changing at the speed of business, and it's very hard for publicly funded systems to keep up. And I guess I'd say one third thing, and that is that the good news is that Mississippi has a number of the building blocks to address those challenges, but I do think that there are policy solutions that would be helpful in terms of both strengthening those building blocks, but also getting to a system which I would characterize as a system of lifelong learning. I think what is going on in business today requires lifelong learning from the workers, and the key question is, how do we build the system that supports it? So just stepping back for a moment, in terms of building blocks, you know, the community colleges, workforce training, and particularly those activities supported by the WET Fund, there's a, good ROI return on investment for that. There's actually equity across race and across gender in terms of who gets that training. Now, looking at the what's going on in the northeastern part of the state, the Mississippi Corridor Consortium, the community colleges have said that all 15 will get into multi-college consortia that also involve other partners. You know, 2 or 3 other things. A couple of the community colleges are experimenting with what can they do with human service organizations, community-based human services, to solve some of those problems that you heard about earlier in terms of what it takes for people to get into skill development and move up. You know, in addition to that, there was the discussion earlier about what about those who don't have the basics around skills, so they can't really take advantage either of going to work or getting the skill development that's systematically offered. Well, some of the community colleges in Mississippi and in Louisiana are trying to find an approach to that that's based on something you heard about earlier, the iBest out of Washington State, but that is a good model for Mississippi and Louisiana. And the last thing I'd say is that there are employers who really understand this, and St. Dominic's Hospital is a good example, where they moved, through workplace training, in affiliation with Hines Community College, moved folks from really low-level jobs, laundry and housekeeping and others, to phlebotomists and other better paid and better skilled jobs. So then what does it take? Well, you know, it seems to me that first of all, there needs to be a support for the glue, for the intermediary capacity, as Mark Popovich called it. What does it take to have employers' needs understood, to build a system that meets those needs and workers' needs? Well, that intermediary idea. We don't really have a good way of funding that, and we don't have a way of placing that at the center of meeting needs on a regional basis. You know, secondly, this issue of the need for social services. I'm getting to the age where I understand the idea that we're all going to be disabled someday, and many of us, it was brought up earlier, need transportation or childcare or whatever the needs are. Building that capacity into our skill development systems, that's a second thing that I think policy can help with. This idea of integrating literacy and occupational skills. Well, there are some models being put forward in Mississippi at the community colleges, but that needs to have policy support. So there are examples of these sorts of things being funded and policy being organized to support it in other states. I'd say those are the challenges, though, that this group of people could address.
So, Dr. Bounds, I'd like you to expand on not only what you've heard today, but also if you could then lead into what are the post-secondary institutions in Mississippi, what do they view their charge as being around workforce development, and what are the state education policies that can help you and the institutions that report to you meet those goals?
Sure, I'll try. One of the themes that I heard this morning is this need for more and better education. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter what the question or what the problem is, the answer is education. And workforce development is just a fancy way of talking about educating a group of folks to go into another line of work. And so the thing that worries me about our state and our country, more specifically our state, is that we have so many young children that are getting to third grade without the skill set necessary to be successful in grades beyond that. And so we know that if you can't read proficiently, if you don't read proficient or above by the end of third grade, you're exponentially more likely to drop out of high school, you're exponentially more likely to go to prison. And so that one statistic should cause us all alarm if you're in the area of workforce development, because we know that those folk are going to be pulled out of the system. And so we've just taken a large portion, a large swath of the population out of the ability to really be trained in the future for really good paying jobs, because if you can't read a ruler, if you can't read directions, if you can't do those kinds of things, then it's hard to get the skill sets needed to be successful in a job that will provide a meaningful wage. And so from the university perspective, someone's mentioned earlier how difficult it is to move universities, and so I live that world every day, and I know how difficult it is. But I would say that probably the most important thing that universities do, we don't always act that way, is to prepare teachers and prepare leaders. The better teachers that we have in the classroom, the higher quality those folks, the more potential there is for their students to go on and be successful. So in universities like to blame student failure on high schools like to blame middle schools like to blame elementary schools like to blame parents. And so parents are sending us the best that they have. They're not keeping the best at home. Perhaps we need to think about workforce development with a sort of a two-tier strategy. One strategy is how we focus on those folk who get out into the workforce and how we provide them a skill set. But more importantly, so if we do that, we're always putting a new bandage on. So if we started thinking as a state more about how we are really proactive with this and think about how we provide better teachers, which means there's serious costs there. So in this state, you can, if you graduate with an associate's degree in nursing, you start teaching. You would have to teach 10 years with a bachelor's degree to make the same thing that a starting nurse, an associate degree nurse makes. Clearly, the most important job in this state is being a teacher because it is the absolute foundation for everything else that happens in our economy. So if teachers aren't good, if we're not attracting the best and brightest, then we need to think very differently, and that's a real policy issue. It's a real money issue as well because there are so many, there's a volume issue there. The other thing that I think that in a very poor state like Mississippi that we have to rethink is how we look at our youngest, most vulnerable citizens and how we ensure that they arrive in kindergarten ready to learn. Because we know if they arrive as a 5-year-old with a vocabulary level of a 2-year-old, we know that that's a very good indicator of future reading success. And really, workforce development is, if you can't read, if you can't do basic mathematics, you can't be trained for a job. And so I think at the very core of what needs to be focused on in workforce development, folks ought to think like the CEO of Ingalls. Had a meeting with business leaders across the state about a year ago, and the CEO at Ingalls said, we were talking about this issue, and he said, look, why don't we just focus on third grade reading? So this is a guy that builds the largest, most powerful, most high-tech war machines on the planet. And he says, why don't we all just focus on third grade reading? And so from my perspective, if we would make that a focus, a lot of our other issues would simply evaporate.
So, Mark, if we switch to the other end and talk, there's the combination, there's the need to focus on early childhood and K-12, but there's also a need to focus on a lot of what your system does, which is focusing more on the adults as well as some of the dislocated youth. So what do you believe are some of the areas that the Mississippi Employment Securities Office really needs to focus on from a policy perspective that's going to address what you mentioned in your earlier remarks about the need to provide more flexibility?
Well, I think that employers are telling us that even more than a trained workforce, because they want that, but even more than a trained workforce, they want a highly motivated workforce. That might be another way for what Dr. Nicole Smith said this morning about being conscientious. And so one of the things that we've thought about at the Department of Employment Security is how do we find employees, workers for the private sector who are going to be highly motivated. The thought occurred to me, what about veterans? Can you think of a more highly motivated group? Can you think of a group that has learned more to work together to solve problems, to work toward a goal, to accomplish that goal, who know when to show up on time, who know to continue working until they've gotten the job done? Well, combine that with the fact that younger veterans who have served since 9/11, have an unemployment rate that is twice the national average. So you think about that. The people who have gone off to defend us are having a harder time finding a job than those of us who stayed here at home. So at the Department of Employment and Security, we've launched a special effort to try to help veterans get jobs in Mississippi. It's not only, of course, good for the veterans, it's good for the employees. So let me tell you a couple of things that we've done. In the 2013 session, we drafted some legislation, got it introduced. I wish that Donnie Bell were still here because he helped with this. It passed both houses of the legislature unanimously. Can you think of the last time an important bill did that? And it told our licensing agencies, the agencies in the state that hand out various occupational licenses, it told them to give military veterans credit toward those licenses based on their comparable military training. Let me give you an example. If you had served in the military as a medic, I bet you've got a lot, if not all of the training you need to become an EMT. But generally, states do not give credit for that. The vast majority of states do not give credit for that. So Mississippi, I believe, was about the 8th state in the country to do that. And instead of being last at something, we were one of the first at it. So we've done that. By the way, to help veterans transition or help people when they're still in the military transition, the bill also said that military spouses could get temporary occupational licenses here in Mississippi if they had already been licensed in a state that had comparable standards while they're working on getting their permanent license. We heard something this morning about nurses and licensing. And let me tell you, I don't know why it takes this long, and I don't mean to be critical because perhaps it takes this long. But if you were a nurse, an RN, and you were licensed in Illinois, and you applied to get a license here in Mississippi, it might take you 9 months to get that done. Now, if your spouse is in the military and you're transferred here to Mississippi, and you're a nurse, do you want to sit around for 9 months waiting until you get your permanent license? So it said in cases like that, if Illinois, where you have been licensed, and if it has comparable standards to Mississippi, then our licensing agency for RNs should go ahead and give you a temporary license so you can go ahead and go to work and help your family. One of the other things we've done is Governor Bryant declared 2013 the year to hire Mississippi heroes. We've had a special effort to do that. He's had press conferences about that. He helped organize 3 job fairs across the state that were targeted at veterans and their spouses. So that's one thing we've done to try to link highly motivated would-be employees with employers. One other thing, and I know Hank Bounds knows about this because he and I have discussed it. You heard this morning about one of the segments that leaves the state of Mississippi are our recent college graduates. So we have started a program working with the colleges in which the seniors, by that I mean they're about to graduate, when they contact their placement office there on campus, that they're given the opportunity to be placed in our system. They have to say, I don't want to be in your system. Unless they tell us that, they're placed in our system, our job matching system. And the great thing about it is somebody else can put them in the system. Their mama can put them in the system. Of course, they can drop out, but still, mama could put them in the system. We've had thousands of students do this. And what is the point of this? Well, I'll tell you 2 things. One, I went to a meeting once, and an employer said, I'm having a hard time hiring an engineer. And so I said, have you been to Mississippi State? Have you been to Ole Miss? Have you been to Jackson State? They all produce engineers. He said, I'm too busy trying to run the company to do that. So that's one thing. They don't have to go to Mississippi State. In effect, we can bring Mississippi State to them. The second thing is, if that college graduate or about to be college graduate wants to take a job in Seattle or Singapore, that's fine. But what if that graduate might be interested in taking a job in Senatobia if that graduate knew there was a job in Senatobia for him? So we're working on that as well. Let me mention one more thing, and I'll go. The Department of Labor says that the Department of Employment and Security has the most advanced computer system in the country. Mark Henry didn't say that. Phil Bryant didn't say that. The Department of Labor said that. That is why Mississippi is one of a handful of states chosen by the Department of Labor to really combine all of our systems into one, so that a person would go and would register only once. And by registering only once, that person would get all of our job search services. That person would also be signed up for unemployment benefits if that person qualified. That person would be told, this is the kind of training you need to upgrade your skills. This is where the training is available. This is how you can get the training. And it will also tell that person before that person leaves the website, here are some suggested job openings you might want to go ahead and apply for. So we're trying to combine all that into one experience that is done as timely and efficiently as possible.
So Jack, can you talk to us a little bit and provide some concrete examples, maybe 2 or 3 of policy innovations that are related to workforce development that you've seen through your national network? And we've heard a little bit earlier about sectors and about workforce intermediaries. But if you could talk a little bit about the policy implications that you've seen of things that are actually working and might be of relevance here in Mississippi.
So on the policy side, I guess one of the things that I'd highlight, I'll just pull this out here. State budgets are starting to come back. And so one question is, what kind of resources should be allocated to meet those needs where there are holes? And if you look at Wisconsin, for instance, they allocated $10 million to support these kinds of innovative practices in their last biennial budget. Going to Iowa, this issue of how do you integrate adult basic education with occupational skill development is an important one across the country. And they allocated, just check the number, well, $10 million again, to do that work and connect the result, the integrated education that results, to career paths. So those are 2 examples on the funding side. But I believe there are more important things even than the money. Our systems have tremendous resources between funding and also other kinds of capacity. Aligning those resources is very, very important, and many states have set up state-level leadership bodies. Typically, not only do they include the heads of the state agencies, and I'm talking about workforce development and economic development and education and human services, but they also include substantial representation for the business community, particularly in those industries where there's importance of the industry in various different regions of the state. Oftentimes, they also include successful practitioners, people who are running effective programs. And the purpose of those bodies, often led by the governor, is to say, we want to use our money and our agency resources as effectively as we possibly can. We want to break down the silos, use those resources in sync, and yes, it's going to be difficult, but let's get the job done. So those are 2 kinds of things that we've seen in states.
Well, the truth of the matter is, if you ask parents those questions at the same time, what's the truth about that question? Every one of them will say, I want my child to get a college degree. And so in large measure, we're dealing with not only messaging to boys and girls, but we're also messaging to parents. And frankly, that's a tough message to deliver as educators. It is tough sledding to expect teachers, principals, and superintendents to do all of this. If they could, they would. And so there's got to be a concerted effort among business leaders to get into schools, to talk to those parents, to talk to their employees. When I was state superintendent, I did a tour and run a lot of communities with MEC, and I would always have business leaders say to me, well, Hank, I run a factory with X. What can we do? We want to help. What do we do? And I say to them, your employees work for X dollars an hour. They have no flexible dollars, right? They can't miss work. Every penny they make goes to take care of things that they have to have. And so for them to miss a couple of hours of work and go to school places a real burden on them, because it's either they do that or they pay the electric bill. And so what I say to employers is, why don't you be creative in carving out time, because a couple of hours to Ingalls for that employee to go and see what's happening with their child and speak to the counselor, because the problem is counselors work 8 to 3 and then a couple more hours, and that during the time that they are working, your employees are also working. And so unless we figure out a way to get counselors and teachers to go into homes at night, we've sort of set up this impossible, we have this sort of Gordian knot issue. And so employers have to be part of this solution. Pre-K is the first day of college. You will never hear me talking about the need for all graduates to go to college. That's crazy. It will never work. The jobs will never be there. We're asking them to take on debt. And we also don't talk enough, as you mentioned earlier, about we don't do a good enough job at the university level to talk about the types of degrees that someone should major in, because there are degrees that are, I think liberal arts education is a really good education, and I think it's worthwhile. And the reason I think it is because in most businesses, you want employees that can communicate, that can think on their feet, that can be nimble, that can learn new skills. And so I think a liberal arts education is very good for many of the jobs, and many of the jobs that will be created over the next 20 years that we're not even thinking about today. And so I think there's real value in a liberal arts education. And so there's need for that there's need for education beyond just being an engineer or just being a CPA, because I think liberal arts education allows students to be much more flexible over the course of their career.